Hello and welcome to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Bertie Harrison-Broninsky, and today I'm talking to Anthropology Professor Gökçe Günel from Rice University about controversial mega projects in the Middle East that aim to create new, sustainable smart cities from scratch. One of these is Masdar City, which was the subject of Gökçe's book titled Spaceship in the Desert, Energy, Climate Change and Urban Design in Abu Dhabi. Masdar City was announced in 2006 with $22 billion funding from the Abu Dhabi government, but the development has well exceeded its original timeline, and it has failed to become a zero-emissions city, as originally promised. We're also going to discuss NEOM, which is a 10,000 square mile area of Saudi Arabia, where Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has ambitions for a number of large-scale projects. Collectively, NEOM is estimated to cost more than $8 trillion, and many of its projects were originally intended to be complete by 2030. The most well-known is The Line, a planned, smart and zero-emissions city that would be housed entirely in a single 100-mile-long building. These are fascinating projects that raise a lot of questions. Are they opportunities to accelerate innovation in green urban design, or are they unviable vanity projects by autocrats? What influence have these announcements had internationally, and why would states that rely on fossil fuel revenues so strongly want to build cities powered by clean energy?
Much of the work that went into making climate change a topic of expertise in the UAE actually allowed the UAE to then insert itself into climate change debates and have oil and gas companies become significant players in climate change policy.
I began by asking Gökçe about her experience of spending a year in Masdar City in the early 2010s.
I became interested in Masdar City because I was researching urban transformation in the United Arab Emirates in 2008 when the Great Recession hit. And many of the projects I was interested in tracking collapsed during that summer, with the exception of Masdar City. Once all the real estate development projects in Dubai started collapsing, I became drawn to what Abu Dhabi was doing. Masdar City had something called Masdar Institute at its center. Masdar Institute was a renewable energy clean technology research center that was started by MIT. And I could contact people at MIT and ask them what Masdar Institute was doing and what kinds of projects they concentrated on and what their goals were. And the people at MIT were PhD students like I was, and they were quite helpful. And they invited me to come and see the campus, and they were quite open to having me join their teams and collaborate with them, which meant that I started doing research on Masdar City, on its sort of development in the summer of 2008, and continued in 2009, 2010, 2011. So I lived in the UAE in 2010 and 2011. And that's the period when Masdar City first opened its doors to its first residents. And so it was a really critical period to observe the project. And then I continued doing research there until 2014. Even though my initial objectives were around understanding the transformations of urban space, I became really excited to actually explore renewable energy and clean technology related questions alongside the people who were building Masdar City.
You should probably, before we get into the detail of that more, do a bit of an elevator pitch of what is Masdar City, what was the original idea, and how much of that has come to fruition since.
I like to think of Masdar City as an economic diversification project. So Abu Dhabi is an oil-rich emirate. So it's one of the 7 emirates that make up the United Arab Emirates, and it is the capital of the United Arab Emirates, and it's the most oil-rich emirate in the country. One of the challenges that Abu Dhabi is facing today, or has been facing in the last, let's say, 20 years or so, is to consider what's going to happen when oil runs out or becomes less valuable. This is not only about safeguarding the Emirates from a future where oil is no longer a relevant fuel, but it's also a way to protect the country from the fluctuations in the oil price and to be able to actually offer a certain kind of stability where there are other revenue streams that emerge from other kinds of areas. And so because Abu Dhabi is already so embedded in fossil fuel networks or in energy networks more broadly, it made sense for them to invest in renewable energy and clean technology research and other kinds of specializations around renewable energy, clean technology. And so the Masdar City project was started as a way to house all this kind of innovation. And it was a master plan by Foster and Partners in London. Foster was also doing other projects in the UAE at the time. They built like a souk in Abu Dhabi around the same period. And so they had experience working with decision makers in the UAE. So after sort of a competition, they were able to start designing the master plan for a city of 40,000 commuters and 50,000 residents. And they had a budget of $22 billion in starting the project. And it was about a 6-kilometer square site near the Abu Dhabi airport and next to the Formula One tracks that were also under construction at the time and next to a golf course. When I describe this layout or this kind of Masdar City's neighbors, people often ask, well, it's such a contradiction. Why are they doing an environmental project next to an airport, next to a golf course, or next to the Formula One tracks? But if you see this as not an environmental project, but as an economic diversification project, all of this actually makes sense and fits together more seamlessly. The environment, as many of the people I met in Abu Dhabi told me, was a sexy part of the economy. And so why shouldn't decision makers in the UAE also pitch in and see if they can gain another revenue stream from environmental topics? So by investing in renewable energy and clean technology, by providing consulting, let's say, on how to apply for carbon credits from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, etc. So there are many different ways in which such expertise was developed at Masdar City. But of course, the city itself, as a shell for all these projects or as the site on which the projects happen, was also very significant because it attracted a lot of attention to the UAE. It was on the front page of the New York Times. Everyone thought about it or studied it as an investigation into how eco-friendly living might happen in the future. And even though the only part of the master plan that still remains is the Masdar Institute campus, the project still carried a lot of weight and it circulated significantly, I think created the communications-focused impact the UAE wanted it to create. The students who were attending Masdar Institute, they were from all around the world. They were all receiving stipends to go to school at Masdar Institute, and they were all doing master's degrees there. They were the first residents of Masdar City. So they also became test subjects on how to live in an eco-friendly environment. And there were many ways in which they became test subjects, I guess. But there were experiments that they were actually participating in, such as when Masdar Institute scientists measured their electricity and water consumption patterns and tried to understand how they can regulate such consumption. Or when they just became residents in their dorm rooms and tried to understand if they were actually fitting in with the expectations of the building more broadly, if they were living according to the needs of the building or according to the needs of the city. Another important aspect of the city that received a lot of attention was the fact that it had personal rapid transit as its transportation infrastructure. Like many aspects of Masdar City, even though the personal rapid transit infrastructure received a lot of attention, it actually only took passengers from the parking lot outside Masdar City to the Masdar Institute building. So there were only 2 stops and a very short distance between these 2 stops. So the personal rapid transit was shuttling people back and forth. And it was framed as a new technology, but in fact, the technology itself has been around since the mid-20th century.
Just to clarify, when we talk about the master plan being cancelled, we're thinking of headline sustainability elements like it being net zero, the city itself, and not having any cars within it, right?
The developers advertise it as being a zero carbon city. But when people started living at Masdar City or when they started actually going there for work, so for instance, people like scientists or engineers at Masdar Institute, many of those residents started debating what zero carbon means. Because now they were having an embodied experience of being part of this city. And they realized they're commuting from Dubai. That's like almost 120 kilometers for some people. So that's like an hour drive there and back. And many of them were from other countries. So some people would like maybe fly to Kolkata like every other weekend to see families. They started wondering, well, how about all the emissions from transportation? Are they actually being added to this spreadsheet to account for the sort of the zero carbon nature of the city? Or they started wondering, there was a very nice cafeteria at Masdar Institute and also another cafeteria in another part of Masdar City where people ate lunch, and they wondered, how about the food that's being brought here for us? And is this being accounted for in the calculation around zero carbon? And is zero carbon achievable in that sense? Or if I buy an apple from the grocery store at Masdar City, how do I actually calculate whether that apple is being balanced out with the electricity production that's happening on site here? And eventually the term zero carbon was dropped because none of these questions could be answered in a valid manner, in a satisfying manner. And so the eco-city sustained itself with the name, let's say, an eco-city, but without adjectives such as zero carbon. When the master plan was cancelled, the UAE government became interested in developing sustainability measures that they would then perhaps apply to the developers who want to build buildings in the city. So they still had this site that was designated as Masdar City, but they thought, why not develop it just in the same way that we develop any other site? So we'll have people who are interested in building buildings here, and we'll meet with them and we'll tell them that these are the sustainability measures they need to abide by. And if they're okay with that, we'll reach an agreement. So once the master plan was cancelled, there was a loose imagination that the city would still maintain its status as a renewable energy clean technology center, but it wouldn't necessarily have the architectural continuity that Foster had imagined. Partially, that imagination has been fulfilled. For instance, Abu Dhabi now has a nuclear power plant, and the headquarters of that nuclear power plant are inside Masdar City in a standalone building that's not part of the master plan. Abu Dhabi was also able to attract the International Renewable Energy Agency, and International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, also has its headquarters inside Masdar City in another standalone building.
You talk a lot about success and failure in your book, but outside of green objectives, has it been a successful investment or a successful political endeavor for the UAE government? Does it matter if it reaches the end goals to be successful in those ways?
That's a great question. And actually, the answer to that question is, I think, constantly evolving. When I published the book in 2019, I argued that the decision makers who funded or built Masdar City were not that interested in questions around success and failure. They were really interested in the potential of the project. And by potential, they all meant different things. And one of the ways in which I've been able to track that potential over the last, let's say, 2 decades is by looking at the evolution of something called carbon capture and storage. I assume that some of your listeners are already familiar with carbon capture and storage, but it's a technology where you capture carbon dioxide from industrial sites and then carry that carbon dioxide into storage sites around wherever you have access to storage sites, and then inject it into the ground. So in the case of the UAE, it makes sense to inject carbon dioxide into depleted or less functional oil wells and to store carbon dioxide, or actually use carbon dioxide in order to enhance oil production, which is the process known as enhanced oil recovery. At the beginning of my research in 2008, 2009, there was a lot of interest in developing carbon capture and storage as a climate change mitigation technology. The people I worked with at Masdar, some were environmental consultants. They were really interested in being able to put together a submission to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to be able to show that carbon capture and storage should be accepted as a mitigation technology, and that corporations who use carbon capture and storage should receive carbon credits for the work that they do. Environmental consultants at Masdar saw this kind of work as being really significant, not necessarily because they needed the carbon credits from carbon capture and storage, but because they thought it would be a considerable diplomatic gain for the United Arab Emirates. They had an alliance with other oil-producing countries such as Norway and Saudi Arabia, and this alliance worked together in order to produce the right language to submit to the United Nations and find the right negotiators to attend the climate summits. And eventually, in 2012, carbon capture and storage was accepted as a climate change mitigation technology. Even when it was accepted, there was so much ambiguity around when or how it would be used. But that didn't necessarily matter to decision makers in the UAE. What mattered was that now the UAE was actually a significant player in climate debates. And you can see the evolution from that moment in 2012 all the way to 2023, when the UAE was able to host the climate summit. So much of the work that went into making climate change a topic of expertise in the UAE actually allowed the UAE to then insert itself into climate change debates and have oil and gas companies become significant players in climate change policy. Even though Masdar City's buildings did not necessarily get built in the ways that it was imagined, so many of the ideas that went into making the city still continued and actually are still shaping the way in which environmental governance happens today. Sultan Al Jaber, who was the president of the Climate Summit in 2023, was the CEO of Masdar when I was doing research there. He grew his expertise on energy and climate change issues through his tenure there.
That leads nicely on to a kind of more current political question I was going to ask, really, which is partly how the election of Trump is affecting these projects, because there has been a big shift with climate goals internationally in the past year, and also whether that existential threat of reliance on oil is the same now as you describe it 20 years ago, or a bit less, 15 years ago in Abu Dhabi.
In the United Arab Emirates, when I was doing research there in the early 2000s and in the 2010s, the temporal horizon for all these projects was set to about 100 years from now. So the economic diversification efforts are going to happen now, but this is one reason why trial and error is also a possible mode, because you have 100 years to test out different technologies and sectors and see what happens in that time frame. And so the imagination of the end of oil was not something that was going to happen in 2 years from now or 5 years from now. The temporal horizon was quite extended in that sense. And now when I attend oil and gas conferences here in Houston, for instance, I hear similar conversations. There is an understanding that oil and gas is going to come to an end. But one of the things that needs to happen from the perspective of oil and gas companies, for instance, the task is then to defer that time horizon as much as they can, and to employ different kinds of technologies of deferral in order to ensure that oil and gas has the longest life it can have.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the big picture, centuries-long timescales that played into Masdar City. I wanted to ask you about NEOM in Saudi Arabia as well, which I think did have a kind of 2030 target for some of its objectives. And when you look up news about NEOM now, you similarly to Masdar see quite different narratives. Just this summer, there were stories about construction workers being laid off, but then also stories about more indigenous groups being displaced by forced evictions. And clearly there is new work freshly continuing. Could you tell us a little bit about NEOM, and should we expect anything to have materialized significantly by 2030? What is the kind of future of that project?
I see many similarities between Masdar City and NEOM. They both draw on the histories of the oil town, which is a significant urban force in the Arabian Peninsula, where there is a dominant industry that organizes life for all the residents of that town. And there are hierarchies that are based on the hierarchies that the industry creates. And so they're reflected spatially as well. And the Aramco's Dahran is a very good example of that. And so in some ways, even though these city projects are being proposed as novel projects, I see them as actually being ways for repurposing the oil town and with different kinds of industries at its center. So for Masdar City, that industry is renewable energy, clean technology. For NEOM, it's artificial intelligence, basically, and surveillance technologies. It is a different economic diversification strategy for Saudi Arabia to build NEOM, to invest in real estate through NEOM, and to imagine that artificial intelligence will grow through the construction of NEOM as a city. It's not a city really, it's what they define as a region because it has 5 cities in it. It's massive in comparison to Masdar City. But the logic of it, I think, is quite similar. And the media attention that NEOM has received is also similar to Masdar City. And it's also putting Saudi Arabia on the map for doing experimental projects, for having the capacity to imagine a different kind of living in Saudi Arabia, etc. So there are similar imaginaries that are being circulated through Masdar City and through NEOM. Another similarity they have, which I find fascinating, is how they foreground ideas of progress. So these ideas were quite ordinary in the mid-20th century when post-colonial nations were building new cities or new capitals. But these are not necessarily ideals that we see circulating frequently in 2025. Whereas with Masdar City and NEOM, there's an imagination that the future is going to be much better than where we are today, and that oil and gas might disappear, but there will be new technologies to replace them, and that life will continue exactly as it is. So in the book, I describe this as being a status quo utopia. So these are utopian projects that imagine preserving social, political, and economic relations as they are, even in a future where environmental conditions or other pressures might make current social, political, and economic relations unfeasible. And that's why it's important that these cities are walled. That's why it's important that they actually have very clear separation from the outside, because inside these utopias will be preserved, while outside the world is imagined as a sort of a space of catastrophe. So climate change conditions will make the desert uninhabitable, perhaps, but inside NEOM, life will continue as usual. So that distinct tension is really important to these city projects, because as the outside is ruined, it becomes more valuable to preserve the inside as a stable, promising living environment. Another fascinating characteristic they share is that they draw on mid-20th century or late 20th century dystopian literature in order to structure the future. Both NEOM and Masdar City have used Blade Runner as an example of what they would like to achieve. And at Masdar City, people who lived at Masdar City or who commented on Masdar City always made fun of this. And they said they want to bring Blade Runner to the fore. Blade Runner is a critique of totalizing environments. Many people would say, we don't want to live in Blade Runner. Why are they telling us that they're creating Blade Runner? But still, it's a kind of reproduction of science fiction from mid-20th century as a way to produce that promising or happy future. So I guess it depends on where you are in that utopia. If you are the decision maker of Blade Runner, then perhaps it's a happy utopia for you. But if you are a resident of Blade Runner, perhaps you have a different perspective on that system.
Yeah, I remember you have a line in the opening chapter of your book about Masdar City talking about it being partly a branding project to make UAE seem more appealing to elites. How much of that sci-fi referencing is marketing towards elites? Or do you think these projects are a sincere attempt at making a kind of haven for the governing class if climate change gets really bad?
The science fiction narratives have a force in the world, regardless of whether they're sincere or insincere. And I think that's what's worth investigating and analyzing. So, for instance, one good example for me was how many people at Masdar City referred to Masdar City as a spaceship in the desert. Initially, one of the students who lived at Masdar City wrote on her blog that she felt like she was living in a spaceship in the middle of the desert. And that was picked up by newspapers. It was picked up by various kinds of executives working at Masdar City. And all of a sudden, there was this phrase, spaceship in the desert. And everyone thought that was a very apt way of describing what Masdar City was. And as a researcher living there and trying to follow how people understood this environment or how people interpreted their own living conditions, I became fascinated with the term spaceship in the desert. And I wanted to understand what it meant for these people, why it became so popular, and how I saw the spaceship in the desert materialize on the ground, because I had that opportunity. And the perfect moment when it materialized for me was when I was touring some of the solar power stations with an engineer who recently finished his PhD in the US, and he was of Egyptian origin, and he wanted to return to the Middle East, and it was a good opportunity for him to start working at Masdar. And as we were touring the site, he told me when we built these solar power stations, we imagined that they would be really effective because it's always sunny here. But we haven't necessarily been able to achieve the efficiency that we thought we would achieve because there's so much dust and mud and humidity here, and thick coatings on the solar panels reduce their efficiency and reduce the electricity output. So he said, but it's not a problem because we found a solution for it. And I was very excited because this is a techno-optimist place, right? So there needs to be a technological solution to this problem. But he said the solution is a man with a brush. And he pointed to the man with a brush. So there was a man actually holding a colorful brush going around and cleaning all the solar panels on a daily basis in order to ensure their efficiency, in order to ensure that they actually receive the kind of electricity output that they planned on achieving. But of course, the spaceship in the desert had no seats for this man with a brush. He was imagined to be outside the spaceship. So the language of spaceship meant that only astronauts would be allowed. So those are people who have expertise to take the spaceship off the ground and ensure its future. And a person who's cleaning the solar panels was not necessarily seen as someone who's necessarily crucial to host in that spaceship. So the technological sophistication of the city meant that there were also clear boundaries about who could be invited in and who had to be left out. And that future that's going to launch when oil is no longer as valuable or when the oil runs out is going to be a future that only allows a select few in. That's why I think it's important to understand what kind of narratives circulate through the emphasis on science fiction. So rather than maybe trying to figure out exactly what they're trying to achieve, what is it that they end up achieving is important to document and analyze.
These are two projects we've been talking about have received a lot of attention internationally. As you say, you could make an argument that they're not as novel as is often reported, and that there are all kinds of urban planning projects going on around the world. How specific do you think the parameters of these projects are to the politics and economy and culture of the Gulf?
For the Gulf, I think they perform a really significant role domestically because they are attempts at governing the future and ensuring the people who live in these countries, there is a certain kind of path forward. And so I think there's a political opportunity in doing that. These projects allow the Gulf countries to enter into various sectors by using these cities. So again, the nuclear power plant is one example, or the development of artificial intelligence in NEOM is another example. I know that NEOM, for instance, I think has the highest hydrogen use now or production, but they have become also facilitators for the Gulf countries as they expand their economic footprint in different industries. There are ways for governing the future.
Do you think the line will ever be built? That's, of all of these projects, that's the one I see the most kind of engineering skepticism around.
I don't know. I know that there's a lot of digging happening around the line and that something is being built there, but I don't know exactly if the line will be built as is. One thing that I think is also really interesting about the line is how the original design of the line, that mid-20th century project, was intended as a critique of modernist architecture, showing that modernist architecture disregards context, disregards the environments in which it appears. But in the same way that Blade Runner changed its meaning and became something desirable that should be implemented, the line's design transformed in meaning and is now being built as something that's desirable, as something that's going to shape the future of the Arabian Peninsula in a positive manner. So the tension between what counts as critique and what counts as something we should all want or be happy to have is palpable in both at Masdar City and at NEOM, which is really worth thinking about.
My thanks to Professor Günel for coming on the show, and to Vasco Kostovski for our audio engineering. There are links to Gökçe's book and other further reading in the blurb below, as well as plenty more on our site at landclimate.org. If you enjoyed this episode, do leave a rating and follow us on your favourite platform. We always appreciate it, and then we'll be back in 2 weeks' time with a new episode. Until then, thanks for listening.